Good Night, Mr. James, by Clifford D. Simak. Originally published in the March 1951 issue of Galaxy magazine. In the next 3 years, it was republished in a French version of the same and a Galaxy anthology. In 1958, it was included in another anthology, and in 1962, it was included in another collection of the author's tales, this one called All the Traps of Earth and Other Stories. From here on, it appeared in far too many international magazines and anthologies, and even further collections of Simak-only stories to mention here. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Good night, Mr. James. He became aware from non-remembering. He came alive from nothing. He smelled the earth and the night and heard the trees whispering on the embankment above him, and the breeze that had set the trees to whispering came down to him and felt him over with soft and tender fingers, for all the world as if it were examining him for broken bones or contusions and abrasions. He sat up and put both his hands down upon the ground beside him to help him sit erect, and stared into the darkness. His name was Henderson James, and he was a human being, and he was sitting somewhere on a planet that was called the Earth. He was 36 years old, and he was, in his way, famous and comfortably well off. He lived in an old ancestral home on Summit Avenue, which was a respectable address even if it had lost some of its smartness in the last 20 years or so. On the road above the slope of the embankment, a car went past with its tires whining on the pavement, and for a moment its headlights lighted up the treetops. Far away, muted by the distance, a whistle sobbed, and somewhere else a dog was barking with a flat monotony. His name was Henderson James, and if that were true, why was he here? Why should Henderson James be sitting on the slope of an embankment, listening to the wind in the trees and to a sobbing whistle and a barking dog? Something had gone wrong, some incident that, if he could but remember it, might answer all his questions. There was a job to do. He sat and stared into the night and found that he was shivering, although there was no reason that he should, for the night was warm. Beyond the embankment he heard the sounds of a city late at night, the distant whine of the speeding car and the far-off wind-broken screaming of a siren. Once a man walked along a street close by, and James sat listening to his footsteps until they faded out of hearing. Something had happened, and there was a job to do, a job that he had been doing, a job that somehow had been strangely interrupted by the inexplicable incident which had left him lying here on this embankment. He checked himself. Clothing. Shorts and shirt, strong shoes, his wristwatch, and the gun in the holster at his side. A gun! The job involved a gun. He had been hunting something with a gun, something that was prowling in the night, and a thing that must be killed. Then he knew the answer, but even as he knew it, he sat for a moment wondering at the strange, methodical, step-by-step progression of reasoning that had brought him to the memory. First his name and the basic facts pertaining to himself, then the realization of where he was and the problem of why he happened to be there, and finally the realization that he had a gun and that he meant to use it. It was a logical way to think, a primer schoolbook way to think. I am a man. I live in a house on Summit Avenue. Am I in the house on Summit Avenue? No, I am not in the house on Summit Avenue. I am on an embankment somewhere. Why am I on the embankment? But it wasn't the way a man thought. At least not the normal way a normal man would think. Man thought in shortcuts. He cut across the block and did not go all the way around. It was a frightening thing, he told himself, this clear around the block thinking. It wasn't normal, and it wasn't right, and it made no sense at all. No more sense than did the fact that he should find himself in a place with no memory of getting there. He rose slowly to his feet and ran his hands up and down his body. He wasn't messed up. His clothes were neat, not rumpled. He hadn't been beaten up, and he hadn't been thrown from a speeding car. There were no sore places on his body, and his face was smooth and whole, and he felt all right. He hooked his fingers in the holster belt and shucked it up so it rode tightly on his hips. He pulled out the gun and checked it with expert and familiar fingers, and the gun was okay. He walked up the embankment and reached the road, went across it with a swinging stride to reach the sidewalk that fronted the row of new bungalows. He heard a car coming and stepped off the sidewalk to crouch in a clump of evergreens that landscaped one corner of a lawn. The move was instinctive, and he crouched there, feeling just a little foolish at the thing he'd done. The car went past, and no one saw him. They would not, he realized, have noticed him even if he had remained out on the sidewalk. He was unsure of himself. That must be the reason. There was a blank spot in his life, some mysterious incident that he did not know, and the unknowing of it had undermined the sure and solid foundation of his own existence, had wrecked the basis of his motive, and had turned him, momentarily, into a furtive animal that darted and hid at the approach of his fellow men. That, and something that had happened to him that made him think clear around the block. He remained crouching in the evergreens, watching the street and the stretch of sidewalk, conscious of the white-painted, ghostly bungalows setting back in their landscaped lots. The poodly had escaped, and that was why he was here, hiding on the front lawn of some unsuspecting and sleeping citizen, equipped with a gun and a determination to use it, ready to match his wits and the quickness of brain and muscle against the most bloodthirsty, hate-filled thing yet found in the galaxy. And poodly was dangerous. It was not a thing to harbor. In fact, there was a law against harboring not only a poodly, but certain other alien beasts much less lethal than a poodly. There was good reason for such a law, reason which no one, much less himself, would even think to question. And now the poodly was loose and somewhere in the city. James grew cold at the thought of it, his brain forming images of the things that might come to pass if he did not hunt down the alien beast and put an end to it. Although beast was not quite the word to use, the poodly was more than a beast. Just how much more than a beast he once had hoped to learn. He had not learned a lot, he now admitted to himself, not nearly all there was to learn, but he had learned enough. Enough to frighten him. For one thing, he had learned what hate could be and how shallow an emotion hate turned out when measured against the depth and intensity and the ravening horror of the poodly's hate. Not unreasoning hate, for unreasoning and illogical hate defeats itself, but a rational, calculating, driving hate that motivated a clever and deadly killing machine which directed its rapacity and its cunning against every living thing that was not a poodly. For the beast had a mind and a personality that operated upon the basic law of self-preservation against all comers, whoever they might be, extending that law to the interpretation that safety lay in one direction only, the death of every other living being. No reason was needed for a poodly's killing. The fact that another thing lived and moved and was thus posing a threat, no matter how remote, against a poodly was sufficient reason in itself. It was madness, of course, some illogic planted far back in time and deep in the racial consciousness, but no more illogical, perhaps, than many human tenets. The Poodley had been, and still was for that matter, an unique opportunity for a study in alien behaviorism. Given a permit, one could have studied them on their native planet. Refused a permit, one sometimes did a foolish thing. And foolish acts backfire. James put down a hand and patted the gun at his side, as if by doing so he might derive some assurance that he was equal to the task. There was no question in his mind as to the thing that must be done. He must find the Poodley and kill it, and he must do that before the break of dawn. Anything less than that would be abject and horrifying failure. For the Poodley would bud. It was long past its time for the reproductive act, and there were bare hours left to find it before it had loosed upon the earth dozens of baby Poodleys. They would not remain babies for long. A few hours after budding, they would strike out on their own. To find one Poodley lost in the vastness of a sleeping city seemed bad enough. To track down some dozens of them would be impossible. So it was tonight or never. Tonight there would be no killing on the Poodley's part. Tonight the beast would be intent on one thing only, to find a place where it could rest in quiet, where it could give itself over wholeheartedly and with no interference to the business of bringing other Poodleys into being. It was clever. It would have known where it was going before it had escaped. There would be, on its part, no time wasted in seeking or in doubling back. It would have known where it was going, and long since it had gone there. Already it was there. Already the buds would be rising on its body, bursting forth and growing. There was one place, and one place only, in the entire city where an alien beast would be safe from prying eyes. A man could figure that one out, and so could a Poodley. The question was, would the Poodley know that a man could figure it out? Would the Poodley underestimate a man? Or, knowing that the man would know it too, find another place of hiding? James rose from the evergreens and went down the sidewalk. The street marker at the corner, standing underneath a swinging streetlight, told him where he was, and it was closer to the place where he was going than he might have hoped. The zoo was quiet, except for something that now and then set up a howl that raised one's hackles and made the blood run cold. James, having scaled the fence, stood quietly at its foot, trying to identify the howling animal, but he was unable to place it. More than likely, he told himself, it was a new one. A person simply couldn't keep track of all the zoo's occupants. New ones were coming in all the time, strange, unheard-of creatures from the distant stars. Straight ahead lay the unoccupied moat cage that, up until a day or two before, had held an unbelievable monstrosity from the jungles of one of the Arctian worlds. James grimaced in the dark, remembering the thing. They had finally had to kill it. And now the Poodley was there. Well, maybe not there, but one place that it could be, the one place in the entire city where it might be seen and arouse no comment, for the zoo was filled with animals that were seldom seen, and another strange one would arouse only momentary wonder. One animal more would go unnoticed unless some zoo attendant should think to check the records. There, in that unoccupied cage area, the Poodley would be undisturbed, could quietly go about its business of budding out more Poodleys. No one would bother it, for things like Poodleys were the normal occupants of this place, set aside for the strangers brought to earth to be stared at and studied by that ferocious race, the humans. James stood quietly beside the fence. Henderson James, 36, unmarried, alien psychologist, an official of this zoo, and an offender against the law for having secured and harbored an alien being that was barred from Earth. Why, he asked himself, did he think of himself in this way? Why, standing here, did he catalog himself? It was instinctive to know one's self. There was no need, no sense of setting up a mental outline of one's self. It had been foolish to go ahead with this poodly business. He recalled how he had spent days fighting it out with himself, reviewing all the disastrous possibilities which might arise from it. If the old renegade spaceman had not come to him and had not said over a bottle of most delicious wine that he could deliver for a certain rather staggering sum one live poodly in good condition, it never would have happened. He was sure that, of himself, he never would have thought of it. But the old space captain was a man he knew and admired from former dealings. He was a man who was not adverse to turning either an honest or a dishonest dollar. And yet he was a man, for all of that you could depend on. He would do what you paid him for and keep his lip buttoned tight once the deed was done. He had wanted a poodly, for it was a most engaging beast with certain little tricks that, once understood, might open up new avenues of speculation and approach, might write new chapters in the torturous study of alien minds and manners. But for all of that, it had been a terrifying thing to do, and now that the beast was loose, the terror was compounded, for it was not wholly beyond speculation that the descendants of this one brood the escaped poodly would spawn might wipe out the population of the earth, or at the best, make the earth untenable for its rightful dwellers. A place like the earth, with its teeming millions, would provide a field day for the fangs of the poodlies, and the mind that drove the fangs. They would not hunt for hunger, nor for the sheer madness of the kill, but because of the compelling conviction that no poodly would be safe until Earth was wiped clean of life. They would be killing for survival, as a cornered rat would kill, except that they would be cornered nowhere except in the illogic of their minds. While posses scoured the earth to hunt them down, they would strike in all directions. They would know the ways of guns and traps and poisons, and there would be more and more of them as time went on, for each of them would accelerate their budding to replace with a dozen or 100 the one that might be killed. James moved quietly forward to the edge of the moat and let himself down into the mud that covered the bottom. When the monstrosity had been killed, the moat had been drained and should long since have been cleaned. But the press of work, James thought, must have prevented its getting done. Slowly he waded out into the mud, feeling his way, his feet making sucking noises as he pulled them through the slime. Finally he reached the rocky incline that led out of the moat to the island cage. He stood for a moment, his hands on the great wet boulders, listening, trying to hold his breath so the sound of it would not interfere with hearing. The thing that howled had quieted, and the night was deathly quiet, or seemed at first to be. Then he heard the little insect noises that ran through the grass and bushes, and the whisper of the leaves in the trees across the moat, and the far-off thrumming that was the snoring of a sleeping city. Now, for the first time, he felt fear, felt it in the silence that was not a silence, in the mud beneath his feet, in the upthrust boulders that rose out of the moat. The poodly was a dangerous thing, not only because it was strong and quick, but because it was intelligent. Just how intelligent, he did not know. It reasoned, and it planned, and schemed. It could talk, not as a human talks, probably better than a human talked, for it not only could talk words, but it could talk emotions. It lured its victims to it by the thoughts it put into their minds. It held them entranced with dreams and illusions until it slit their throats. It could purr a man to sleep. It could lull you to inaction. It could drive you crazy with a single flicking thought, hurling a perception so foul and alien that the mind recoiled deep inside itself and stayed there, coiled tight, like a compressed steel spring that had gotten stuck. It should have budded long ago, but it had fought off its budding, holding back against the day when it might escape, planning, now he knew, its revenge against the earth, its conquest of the earth. It had planned, and planned well, against this very moment, and it would stand upon no ceremony with anyone who interfered with it. His hand went down and touched the gun, and he felt the muscles in his jaw involuntarily tightening, and suddenly there was at once a lightness and a hardness in him that had not been there before. He pulled himself up the boulder face, seeking cautious hand and toe holds, breathing shallowly, body pressed against the rock, quickly and surely, and no noise, for he must reach the top and be there before the poodly knew there was anyone around. The poodly would be relaxed and intent upon its business, engrossed in the budding forth of that numerous family that in days to come would begin the grim and relentless crusade to make an alien planet safe for poodlies, and for poodlies alone. That is, if the poodly were here. If it was not here, it might be in any of 1,000 other places. His claw hand found grass and earth, and he sank his fingers deep into the soil, hauling his body up the last few feet of the rock face above the pit. He lay flat upon the gently sloping ground, listening, tensed for any action. He studied the ground in front of him, probing every foot. Distant street lamps, lighting the zoo walks, threw back the total blackness that had engulfed him as he climbed out of the moat, but there still were areas of shadow that he had to study closely. Inch by inch he squirmed his way along, being sure of the terrain immediately ahead before he moved a muscle. He held the gun in a rock-hard fist, ready for instant action, watching for the faintest hint of motion, alert for any hump or irregularity that was not rock or bush or grass. Minutes magnified themselves into hours. His eyes ached with staring, and the lightness that had been in him drained away, leaving only the hardness, which was as tense as a drawn bowstring. A sense of failure began to seep into his mind, and with it came the full-fledged, until now unadmitted, realization of what failure meant, not only for the world, but for the dignity and the pride that was Henderson James. Now, faced with the possibility, he admitted to himself the action he must take if the poodly were not here, if he did not find it here and kill it. He would have to notify the authorities, would have to attempt to alert the police, must plead with newspapers and radio to warn the citizenry, must reveal himself as a man who, through pride and self-conceit, had exposed the people of the earth to this threat against their hold upon their native planet. They would not believe him. They would laugh at him until the laughter died in their torn throats, choked off with their blood. He sweated thinking of it, thinking of the price this city and the world would pay before it learned the truth. The poodly rose in front of him, not more than 6 feet away from its bed beside a bush. He jerked the pistol up, and his finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't," the poodly said inside his mind. "I'll go along with you." His finger closed tight against the metal, and the gun leaped in his hand. But even as it did, he felt the whiplash of terror slash at his brain, caught for just a second the terrible import, the mind-shattering obscenity that glanced off his mind and ricocheted away. "Too late," he told the poodly. You should have tried that first. You wasted precious seconds. You would have got me if you had done it first. It had been easy, he told himself, much easier than he had thought. The Poodley was dead or dying, and the Earth and its millions of unsuspecting citizens were safe. And, best of all, Henderson James was safe. Safe from indignity, safe from being stripped naked of the little defenses he had built up through the years to shield him against the public stare. He felt relief flood over him, and it left him slightly breathless and feeling clean, but weak. "You fool," the dying Poodley said, death clouding its words as they built up in his mind. "You fool. You half-thing. You duplicate." It died then, and he felt it die, felt the life go out of it and leave it empty. He rose softly to his feet, and his mind seemed stunned, and at first he thought it was from knowing death, from having touched hands with death within the Poodley's mind. The Poodley had tried to fool him. Faced with the pistol, it had tried to throw him off his balance, to give it the second that it needed to hurl the mind-blasting thought that had caught at the edge of his brain. If he had hesitated for a moment, he knew it would have been all over with him. If his finger had slackened for a moment, it would have been too late. The Poodley must have known that he would think of the zoo as the first logical place to look, and even knowing that, it had held him in enough contempt to come here, had not even bothered to try to watch for him, had not tried to stalk him, had waited until he was almost on top of it before it moved. And that was queer, for the Poodley must have known, with its uncanny powers, every move that he had made. It must have maintained a casual contact with his mind every second of the time since it had escaped. He had known that, and... Wait a minute. He hadn't known it until this very moment, although knowing it now, it seemed as if he had always known it. "What is the matter with me?" he thought. "There's something wrong with me. I should have known I could not surprise the Poodley, and yet I didn't know it. I must have surprised it, for otherwise it would have finished me off quite leisurely at any moment after I climbed out of the moat." "You fool," the Poodley had said. "You fool. You half-thing. You duplicate. You duplicate." He felt the strength and the personality and the hard, unquestioned identity of himself as Henderson James, human being, drain out of him as if someone had cut the puppet string, and he, the puppet, had slumped supine upon the stage. So that was why he had been able to surprise the Poodley. There were two Henderson Jameses. The Poodley had been in contact with one of them, the original, the real Henderson James, had known every move he made, had known that it was safe so far as that Henderson James might be concerned. It had not known of the second Henderson James that had stalked it through the night. Henderson James, duplicate. Henderson James, temporary. Henderson James, here tonight, gone tomorrow. For they would not let him live. The original Henderson James would not allow him to continue living, and even if he did, the world would not allow it. Duplicates were made only for very temporary and very special reasons, and it was always understood that once their purpose was accomplished, they would be done away with. Done away with. Those were the words exactly. Gotten out of the way, swept out of sight and mind, killed as unconcernedly as one chops off a chicken's head. He walked forward and dropped on one knee beside the Poodley, running his hand over its body in the darkness. Lumps stood out all over it, the swelling buds that now would never break to spew forth in a loathsome birth a brood of Poodley pups. He rose to his feet. The job was done. The poodle had been killed, and killed before it had given birth to a horde of horror. The job was done, and he could go home. Home? Of course, that was the thing that had been planted in his mind, the thing they wanted him to do, to go home, to go back to the house on Summit Avenue, where his executioners would wait, to walk back deliberately and happily to the death that waited. The job was done, and his usefulness was over. He had been created to perform a certain task, and the task was now performed, and while an hour ago he had been a factor in the plans of men, he was no longer wanted. He was an embarrassment and superfluous, and he would be canceled out, neatly and quietly, and with a certain satisfaction that all had gone so well. Now, wait a minute, he told himself. You may not be a duplicate. You do not feel like one. That was true. He felt like Henderson James. He was Henderson James. He lived on Summit Avenue and had illegally brought to Earth a beast known as a poodle in order that he might study it and talk to it and test its alien reactions, attempt to measure its intelligence and guess at the strength and depth and the direction of its non-humanity. He had been a fool, of course, to do it, and yet, at the time, it had seemed important because of many reasons. I'm human, he said, and that was right, but even then the fact meant nothing. Of course he was human. Henderson James was human, and his duplicate would be exactly as human as the original. For the duplicate, processed from the pattern that held every trait and characteristic of the man he was to become a copy of, would differ in not a single basic factor. In not a single basic factor, perhaps, but in certain other things. For no matter how much the duplicate might be like his pattern, no matter how full-limbed he might spring from his creation, he still would be a new man. He would have the capacity for knowledge and for thought, and in a little time he would have and know and be all the things that his original was. But it would take some time, some little time, to come to a full realization of all he knew and was, some time to coordinate and recognize all the knowledge and experience that lay within his mind. At first he'd grope and search until he came upon the things that he must know, until he became acquainted with himself, with the sort of man he was. He could not reach out blindly in the dark and put his hand exactly and unerringly upon the thing he wished. That had been exactly what he'd done. He had groped and searched. He had been compelled to think, at first, in simple basic truths and facts. I am a man. I am on a planet called Earth. I am Henderson James. I live on Summit Avenue. There is a job to do. It had been quite a while, he remembered now, before he had been able to dig out of his mind the nature of the job. Even now he could not find in the hidden, still veiled recesses of his mind the many valid reasons why a man should run so grave a risk to study a thing so vicious as a poodle. There were reasons he knew were there, and in a little time he would know them quite specifically. The point was that if he were Henderson James, original, he would know them now, know them as part of himself and his life, without laboriously searching for them. The poodle had known, of course. It had known, beyond any doubt of error, that there were two Henderson Jameses. It had been keeping tab on one when another one showed up. A mentality far less astute than the poodle's would have had no trouble in figuring that one out. If the poodle had not talked, he told himself, I never would have known. If it had died at once and not had a chance to taunt me, I would not have known. I would even now be walking to the house on Summit Avenue. He stood lonely and naked of soul in the wind that swept across the moated island. There was a sour bitterness in his mouth. He moved a foot and touched the dead Pudli. "I'm sorry," he told the stiffening body. "I'm sorry now I did it. If I had known, I never would have killed you." Stiffly erect, he moved away. He stopped at the street corner, keeping well in the shadow. Halfway down the block and on the other side was the house. A light burned in one of the rooms upstairs and another on the post beside the gate that opened into the yard, lighting the walk up to the door. Just as if, he told himself, the house were waiting for the master to come home. And that, of course, is exactly what it was doing. An old lady of a house, waiting, hands folded in its lap, rocking very gently in a squeaky chair, and with a gun hid beneath the folded shawl. His lip lifted in half a snarl as he stood there, looking at the house. "What do they take me for?" he thought, "putting out a trap in plain sight and one that's not even baited." Then he remembered. They would not know, of course, that he knew he was a duplicate. They would think that he would think that he was Henderson James, the one and only. They would expect him to come walking home quite naturally, believing he belonged there. So far as they would know, there would be no possibility of his finding out the truth. And now that he had, now that he was here across the street from the waiting house, he had been brought into being, had been given life to do a job that his original had not dared to do or had not wanted to do. He had carried out a killing his original didn't want to dirty his hands in doing or risk his neck in doing. Or had it not been that at all, but the necessity of two men working on the job, the original serving as a focus for the Pudli's watching mind, while the other man sneaked up to kill it while it watched? No matter what, he had been created at a good stiff price from the pattern of the man that was Henderson James. The wizardry of man's knowledge, the magic of machines, a deep understanding of organic chemistry, of human physiology, of the mystery of life, had made a second Henderson James. It was legal, of course, under certain circumstances. For example, in the case of public policy, and his own creation, he knew, might have been validated under such a heading. But there were conditions, and one of these was that a duplicate not be allowed to continue living once it had served the specific purpose for which it had been created. Usually such a condition was a simple one to carry out, for the duplicate was not meant to know he was a duplicate. So far as he was concerned, he was the original. There was no suspicion in him, no foreknowledge of the doom that was spelled out for him, no reason for him to be on guard against the death that waited. The duplicate knitted his brow, trying to puzzle it out. There was a strange set of ethics here. He was alive, and he wanted to stay alive. Life, once it had been tasted, was too sweet, too good, to go back to the nothingness from which he had come. Or would it be nothingness? Now that he had known life, now that he was alive, might he not hope for the same life after death as any other human being? Might not he, too, have the same human right as any other human to grasp at the shadowy and glorious promises and assurances held out by religion and by faith? He tried to marshal what he knew about those promises and assurances, but his knowledge was elusive. A little later, he would remember more about it. A little later, when the bookkeeper in his mind had been able to coordinate and activate the knowledge that he had inherited from the pattern, he would know. He felt a trace of anger stir deep inside of him. Anger at the unfairness of allotting him only a few short hours of life, of allowing him to learn how wonderful a thing life was, only to snatch it from him. It was a cruelty that went beyond mere human cruelty. It was something that had been fashioned out of the distorted perspective of a machine society that measured existence only in terms of mechanical and physical worth, that discarded with a ruthless hand whatever part of that society which had no specific purpose. The cruelty, he told himself, was in ever giving life, not in taking it away. His original, of course, was the one to blame. He was the one who had obtained the poodly and allowed it to escape. It was his fumbling and his inability to correct his error without help which had created the necessity of fashioning a duplicate. And yet, could he blame him? Perhaps, rather, he owed him gratitude for a few hours of life at least, gratitude for the privilege of knowing what life was like, although he could not quite decide whether or not it was something which called for gratitude. He stood there, staring at the house. That light in the upstairs room was in the study off the master bedroom. Up there, Henderson James, original, was waiting for the word that the duplicate had come home to death. It was an easy thing to sit there and wait, to sit and wait for the word that was sure to come. An easy thing to sentence to death a man one had never seen, even if that man be the walking image of one's self. It would be a harder decision to kill him if you stood face to face with him, harder to kill someone who would be, of necessity, closer than a brother, someone who would be almost literally flesh of your flesh, blood of your blood, brain of your brain. There would be a practical side as well, a great advantage to be able to work with a man who thought as you did, who would be almost a second self. It would be almost as if there were two of you. A thing like that could be arranged. Plastic surgery and a price for secrecy could make your duplicate into an unrecognizable other person. A little red tape, some finagling, but it could be done. The room with the light could be reached with a little luck, with strength and agility and determination. The brick expanse of a chimney, its base cloaked by shrubs, its length masked by a closely growing tree, ran up the wall. A man could climb its rough brick face, could reach out and swing himself through the open window into the lighted room. And once Henderson James, original, stood face to face with Henderson James, duplicate, well, anything could happen. The duplicate then would no longer be an impersonal factor. He would be a man, and one that was very close to his original. There would be watchers, but they would be watching the front door. If one were quiet, if he could reach and climb the chimney without making any noise, he'd be in the room before anyone would notice. He drew back deeper in the shadows and considered. It was either get into the room and face his original, gamble on being able to strike a compromise with him, or simply to light out, to run and hide and wait, watching his chance to get completely away, perhaps to some far planet in some other part of the galaxy. Both ways were a gamble, but one was quick, would either succeed or fail within the hour. The other might drag on for months, with a man never knowing he was safe, never being sure. Something nagged at him, a persistent little fact that skittered through his brain and eluded his efforts to pin it down. It might be important, and then again it might be a random thing, simply a floating piece of information that was looking for its pigeonhole. His mind shrugged it off. The quick way or the long way? He stood thinking for a moment, and then moved swiftly down the street, seeking a place where he could cross in shadow. He had chosen the short way. The room was empty. He stood beside the window, quietly, only his eyes moving, searching every corner, checking against a situation that couldn't seem quite true, that Henderson James was not here, waiting for the word. Then he strode swiftly to the bedroom door and swung it open. His finger found the switch and the lights went on. The bedroom was empty, and so was the bath. He went back into the study. He stood with his back against the wall, facing the door that led him into the hallway, but his eyes went over the room foot by foot, orienting himself, feeling himself flow into shape and form, feeling familiarity creep in upon him and enfold him in its comfort of belonging. Here were the books, the fireplace with its mantel loaded with mementos, the easy chairs, the liquor cabinet, and all were a part of him, a background that was as much a part of Henderson James as his body and his inner thoughts were a part of him. This, he thought, is what I would have missed, the experience I never would have had if the Pudley had not taunted me. I would have died an empty and unrelated body that had no actual place in the universe. The phone purred at him, and he stood there startled by it, as if some intruder from the outside had pushed its way into the room, shattering the sense of belonging that had come to him. The phone rang again, and he went across the room and picked it up. "James speaking," he said. "That you, Mr. James?" The voice was that of Anderson, the gardener. "Why, yes," said the duplicate. "Who did you think it was?" "We got a fellow here who says he's you." Henderson James, duplicate, stiffened in his tracks, and his hand, suddenly, was grasping the phone so hard that he found the time to wonder why it did not pulverize to bits beneath his fingers. "He's dressed like you," the gardener said, "and I know you went out. Talked to you, remember? Told you that you shouldn't. Not with us waiting for that thing." "Yes," said the duplicate, his voice so even that he could not believe it was he who spoke. "Yes, I remember talking with you." "But, sir, how did you get back?" "I came in the back way," the even voice said into the phone. "But he's dressed like you." "Naturally. Of course he would be, Anderson." And that, of course, didn't follow, but Anderson wasn't too bright to start with, and the man was somewhat upset. "You remember," the duplicate said, "that we talked about it." "Yes, sir," said Anderson, "and you told me to tell you to make sure you were in your study." "You've called me," the duplicate said, "and I am here." "Then it's him?" "Of course," said the duplicate. "Who did you think it was?" He put the phone back into the cradle and stood waiting. It came a moment after the dull, throaty explosion of a coughing gun. He walked to a chair and sank into it, spent with the knowledge of how events had so been ordered that now finally he was safe beyond all question. Soon he would have to change into other clothes, hide the gun and the clothes that he was wearing. The staff would ask no questions, of course, but it was best to let nothing arouse suspicion in their minds. He felt his nerves quieting, and he allowed himself to glance about the room, take in the books and furnishings, the soft and easy and earned comfort of a man established in the world. He smiled softly. "It will be nice," he said. It had been easy. Now that it was over, it seemed ridiculously easy. Easy because he had never seen the man who walked up to the door. It was easy to kill a man you have never seen. With each passing hour, he would slip deeper and deeper into the personality that was his by right of heritage. There would be no one to question, after a time, not even himself, that he was Henderson James. The phone rang again, and he got up to answer it. A pleasant voice told him, "This is Allen, over at the duplication lab. We haven't had a report from you." "Well," said James, I just called," said Allen, "to tell you not to worry. It slipped my mind before." "I see," said James. "We did this one a little differently," said Allen. An experiment that we just worked out. Slow poison in his bloodstream. Just another precaution. Probably not necessary, but we'd like to be sure. In case he fails to show up, you needn't worry any." "I'm sure he will," said James. Alan chuckled. 24 hours, he said. Like a time bomb, like a fuse. "It was good of you to let me know," said James. "Glad to," said Alan. "Good night, Mr. James." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.